Ma'am, family seating is inside the auditorium. You'll need to check in at the main entrance. The Marine at the gate spoke politely but firmly, gesturing toward the building where proud families were already gathering. Margaret Foster nodded, her weathered hands adjusting the strap of her small purse, but she didn't move toward the doors. "I'm fine here," she said quietly. "I'll wait." The young Marine looked uncertain, glancing at the elderly woman in her simple blue dress and cardigan. She had to be 75 at least, maybe older, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. The morning sun was already warm, promising a hot June day at Camp Pendleton, and the ceremony wouldn't start for another hour. "It's going to get pretty warm out here, ma'am. You'd be more comfortable inside." "I've been in worse heat," Margaret said, and something in her voice, not unkind but absolute, made the Marine nod and return to his post. She found a spot of shade near the edge of the parade ground where she could see the formation area. Other Marines moved past her, some with their families, all of them young and crisp in their dress blues. None of them looked twice at the old woman standing alone, content to wait in the growing warmth while others sought air conditioning and comfortable seats. Margaret had been watching Marines for a long time. She knew how they moved, how they carried themselves, the particular way they stood even when they thought no one was looking. These young men and women had earned something in the past 13 weeks, and it showed in every deliberate step, every unconscious correction of posture. Her grandson David was among them, and she had driven 11 hours from Flagstaff to be here. But the ceremony itself mattered less to her than this moment, watching them prepare, seeing them as they were before the speeches and applause. A staff sergeant walked past, paused, and came back. "Ma'am, are you lost?" "No, Sergeant. Waiting for the graduation." "The family seating is inside, I know." She smiled at him, and he hesitated, then moved on. The sun climbed higher. Margaret didn't move. She watched the drill instructors gathering, watched the way they checked each other's uniforms with exacting precision. She watched a young lance corporal practice his salute 3 times when he thought no one was looking, getting it exactly right. She watched families stream into the auditorium, many of them first-timers who didn't quite know what to expect, who would cry when they saw their sons and daughters for the first time in 3 months. The heat didn't bother her. She'd spent 2 years in conditions that made Southern California look like a resort. The standing didn't bother her either. Her knees ached, had ached for 30 years, but that was just part of the deal. The price paid for choices made long ago. Around her, the base hummed with purposeful activity. Marines moved with that particular efficiency that came from doing things the same way 10,000 times until it became instinct. She recognized it the way some people recognize their hometown accent in a stranger's voice. It was the language of her past, and even now, decades later, it still felt like coming home. A woman about her age walked past with a younger couple, probably her son and daughter-in-law, all of them heading toward the auditorium. The woman glanced at Margaret standing alone in the shade, and there was a moment of concern in her face, a clear question about whether this elderly woman needed help. But Margaret's posture, straight despite the years, steady despite the heat, must have answered it, because the woman simply smiled and continued on. Margaret had been a Marine once, though that world seemed impossibly distant now, separated from her by decades of civilian life, a marriage, 2 children, grandchildren, and a husband, buried 5 years ago in the veteran cemetery in Phoenix. She had been 18 when she enlisted, 22 when she got out, and the years between had shaped everything that came after. The Corps didn't leave you unchanged. It marked you in ways visible and invisible, in scars and calluses and habits so deeply ingrained they became indistinguishable from personality. She had told David some of it years ago when he first mentioned joining. Not the classified parts, not the operations that remained redacted in files she'd never see, but enough. Enough to let him know that the path he was choosing was harder than he imagined and more rewarding than he could understand until he'd walked it. Enough to let him know she understood what he was stepping into. The formation was beginning to assemble now. She could see the recruits, no, Marines now, they'd earned that, lining up in perfect rows. From this distance, they looked identical in their dress blues, but she knew if she got closer, she'd see the individual faces, the ones who were trying not to grin, the ones fighting back tears, the ones locked into warrior face because anything else felt too vulnerable. A young mother with two small children walked past, struggling with a diaper bag and trying to keep the toddler from running off. The bag slipped from her shoulder and spilled onto the pavement, bottles, diapers, wipes scattering across the hot asphalt. Margaret moved without thinking, kneeling despite her protesting knees to help gather the items. The young woman was flustered, apologizing, trying to hold the toddler's hand and collect her things. "Thank you so much," she said as Margaret handed her the last bottle. "I'm such a mess. My husband just graduated from boot camp and I'm already—" She laughed, overwhelmed. "He's lucky to have you here," Margaret said simply. "That matters more than you know." The young woman smiled gratefully and hurried toward the building. Margaret stood slowly, feeling the familiar ache in her knees, the tightness in her right shoulder that had never quite healed properly from an injury in Manila in 1972. She was alone again by the parade ground, content in the solitude, watching the ceremony preparations with the patience of someone who understood that the waiting was part of the honor. The sun beat down. Margaret stayed in the shade but didn't seek further shelter. A major walked past heading toward the main building, and she straightened instinctively to a position that wasn't quite attention but wasn't casual either. Old habits. He didn't notice, but she felt the familiar pull of muscle memory, the body remembering what the mind had filed away. Behind her, she could hear the crowd inside the auditorium, the general murmur of hundreds of families gathering, the expectant buzz of pride and nervousness. Out here, it was quieter. Just the distant commands of drill instructors, the measured footsteps of Marines moving to their positions, the slight rustle of wind through the flags. Margaret had stood in formations like this one, had graduated from her own boot camp in a much different era, when women Marines were still a relative novelty and the world was still processing Vietnam. She had served in a corps that didn't quite know what to do with her, and she had proven herself in ways that were never publicly acknowledged. She had done her job, kept her mouth shut, and walked away when her time was done, carrying her service like a private treasure no one else needed to know about. Her grandson didn't know all of it, couldn't know all of it. Some operations remained classified. Some missions were still filed in archives that wouldn't be opened for another 20 years. But he knew enough to understand that when she said she was proud of him, she understood exactly what he had accomplished and what it had cost him. The heat intensified. Margaret pulled her cardigan tighter despite the temperature, an unconscious gesture. Underneath it on her left forearm was the tattoo she'd gotten in Okinawa in 1973, during a Liberty weekend she barely remembered now. It had seemed important at the time, a way to mark herself as belonging to something larger than herself. The design was simple, the eagle, globe, and anchor, about 3 inches across. The ink faded now to a greenish blue that looked almost like a bruise against her age-spotted skin. She kept it covered mostly, not out of shame but out of habit. It belonged to a younger version of herself, a woman who had done things that seemed impossible from the vantage point of 76 years and a quiet life in Arizona. Movement near the formation caught her eye. The Marines were being called to final positions. This was it, the last few minutes before the ceremony began, the last moments before these young men and women stepped forward into their new identities, before their families saw them transformed. Margaret felt the familiar tightness in her throat, the emotion she'd learned long ago to control but never quite eliminate. Pride, certainly, but also something else. Recognition. These were her people, had always been her people, even though decades and policy changes separated her service from theirs. A voice spoke behind her, sharp with authority but not unkind. "Ma'am, the ceremony is about to begin. You really should take your seat inside." Margaret turned to find a gunnery sergeant, his dress blues immaculate, his bearing that of a man who had spent 25 years earning the respect that came with his rank. She met his eyes steadily. "I'm fine here, Gunny. I can see from here." "It's going to be a long ceremony, ma'am. You'd be more comfortable." "I'm fine," she repeated, and again that quality in her voice, not argumentative, not rude, but absolutely certain, made the gunnery sergeant pause. He studied her for a moment, taking in the straight posture, the weathered hands, the way she stood like someone who had spent considerable time at attention. His eyes narrowed slightly, professional curiosity engaged. "Were you military, ma'am?" "A long time ago," Margaret said. What branch?" She smiled slightly. "Take a guess, Gunny." He looked at her more carefully now, really looked, and she saw the moment he noticed the small things, the way she held herself, the controlled breathing, the unconscious assessment in her eyes as she glanced past him toward the formation. "Marine Corps," he said, not quite a question. 1970 to 1974, Margaret confirmed. Different era. The gunnery sergeant's entire demeanor changed, not to servility, but to recognition, one Marine to another. "Then you understand why you should be inside, ma'am. You earned the right to a good seat. I earned the right to stand where I choose, Gunny, and I choose here." He almost smiled. Almost. Instead, he nodded once, sharp and respectful, and left her alone. The formation was complete now. Margaret could see David somewhere in those ranks, though from this distance she couldn't pick him out individually. It didn't matter. They were all hers in a way. All these young Marines who had chosen the same path she had walked, who had committed themselves to something larger than their own comfort or ambition. The ceremony would be beautiful, she knew. The speeches would be appropriate and moving. The families would cry and cheer. But out here, in this moment before it all began, she could see the truth of it. Young men and women standing in perfect ranks, transformed by discipline and purpose into something older than themselves. The heat pressed down. Margaret didn't move. Her knees ached, her shoulder throbbed dully. The sun was merciless on the parade ground. She had been in worse places, had stood in worse conditions, had endured things that made a June morning in California seem like a pleasant afternoon. This was easy. This was privilege. This was watching the next generation step into the tradition she had helped build, stone by stone, one difficult day at a time. She heard the band warming up inside, the brass section finding their notes. Soon the doors would open and the ceremony would spill out onto the parade ground, all pageantry and precision. But for now, in these last quiet minutes, Margaret stood in the shade and watched, a silent witness to something she understood in her bones, something that had marked her indelibly and would mark these young Marines in ways they were only beginning to comprehend. The base commander's vehicle pulled up near the main building. Margaret saw the flags, the staff car, the sharp salutes as a colonel emerged. He would be the reviewing officer, the one who would address the new Marines and their families, who would speak about honor and commitment and the legacy they were inheriting. He was younger than Margaret, probably in his early 50s, his uniform bearing the ribbons of multiple deployments, a career built on the same foundation she had helped lay decades ago. She watched him walk toward the building, surrounded by his staff, and felt no need to introduce herself or claim recognition. She had never needed that. The service itself had been enough. The knowledge that she had done her part, had contributed to something that would outlast her by centuries, had always been sufficient reward. Inside, the ceremony was beginning. She could hear the announcer's voice, muffled by distance and walls, beginning the formal proceedings. The band struck up. The doors opened and the formation began to march, each step perfectly synchronized, each Marine moving as part of a larger organism that breathed and moved with unified purpose. Margaret's breath caught despite herself. It was always like this. The sight of Marines in formation, the precision of it, the beauty of that much discipline, and will forged into something singular. She had been part of it once, had felt what it was like to move within that organism, to surrender individual will to collective purpose. It was intoxicating and terrifying and glorious, and she had never found anything in civilian life that came close to that intensity of belonging. The formation moved past her position, close enough now that she could see individual faces. Young, so young, some of them barely 18, others in their 20s, but still carrying that raw newness that boot camp hadn't quite polished away. In a few years they would look different, harder or softer, depending on what the Corps asked of them, but today they were purely what they had become in the past 13 weeks, Marines, fresh and proud and ready. She saw David then, third row, center. Her grandson, tall and straight in his dress blues, his face composed in that careful neutral expression they all wore until told otherwise. She felt her throat tighten again, felt the tears she wouldn't allow herself to shed. He looked so much like his grandfather had looked in his Marine Corps photos, the same strong jaw, the same serious eyes. 3 generations now, her late husband, herself, and David. The tradition continuing, the sacrifice renewing itself. The formation halted. Commands echoed across the parade ground, sharp and clear. The new Marines stood at attention while the reviewing officer took his position. Margaret could see him clearly now, the colonel with his chest full of ribbons, his bearing that of a man who had commanded in combat and carried the weight of those decisions with him always. The ceremony proceeded with the familiar ritual, the speeches, the presentation of colors, the oath of enlistment recited by the new Marines in perfect unison. Margaret didn't need to hear the words clearly. She remembered them from her own graduation, remembered speaking them with the fierce conviction of 18 years old and absolutely certain she was stepping into history. She'd been right, though not in the way she imagined. The history had been quieter than she expected, more personal, written in redacted files and classified debriefings rather than public records. She had served in intelligence, had worked on operations that helped end a war most people wanted to forget, had done her job with the same precision these young Marines were learning now. She had been good at it, good enough that her commanding officers had tried to convince her to extend, to make it a career. But she had wanted other things too, a family, a life outside the barbed wire and security clearances, a chance to be something more than her service. So she had walked away after 4 years, honorably discharged, carrying her secrets and her pride in equal measure. She had married, raised children, built a civilian life that was rich and full. But part of her had never left, had remained forever 21 years old and standing at attention, waiting for orders, ready to move anywhere in the world at a moment's notice. The ceremony continued. The heat was oppressive now, the sun directly overhead. Margaret felt sweat trickling down her back under the cardigan, but didn't remove it. The coverage felt necessary, a kind of privacy she had maintained for decades. Her service was her own, not something she displayed or discussed. David knew some of it, her children knew less, and the rest of the world didn't need to know it all. The reviewing officer was speaking now, his voice carrying across the parade ground through the amplification system. He was talking about sacrifice and honor, about the tradition these new Marines were inheriting, about the men and women who had come before them and the legacy they carried forward. Standard speech, Margaret thought, but true nonetheless. Every word of it true. She shifted her weight slightly, easing the pressure on her knees. A couple walked past her toward the seating area, late arrivals hurrying to find their family. The woman glanced at Margaret and slowed. "Are you okay? Do you need to sit down?" "I'm fine," Margaret said. "Thank you." The woman looked uncertain, but her husband was already moving ahead, and she followed, glancing back once with concern. Margaret understood. She looked like someone's grandmother standing in the heat, too stubborn or confused to take a seat. She looked like someone who needed help. But appearances had always been deceiving where Margaret Foster was concerned. The speech concluded. The new Marines were called forward in groups to receive their certificates, to shake the reviewing officer's hand, to have their moment of individual recognition within the collective achievement. It took a long time. There were nearly 400 graduates, but Margaret watched each one. She saw the pride barely contained, the relief, the joy. She saw parents weeping, siblings cheering, children too young to understand waving flags. She saw the drill instructors, stone-faced, watching their recruits become Marines with a pride they would never openly express, but that showed in the rigid set of their shoulders, the slight moisture in eyes they would never admit to. David's turn came. He marched forward with his platoon, crisp and correct, shook the colonel's hand, received his certificate. Margaret allowed herself a small smile. He had done it. He had chosen this path, despite her warnings about how hard it would be, and he had made it through. Whatever came next, deployment, combat, the long grind of a military career, he had proven he could handle the first test. The ceremony was concluding now, the final speeches being made, the band preparing to play the Marine Corps hymn. Margaret straightened despite her aching knees, preparing for the moment she'd been waiting for, that final salute when the new Marines would render honors and officially join the brotherhood she had been part of for 50 years, whether she wore the uniform or not. The music began. That familiar melody that every Marine knew by heart, that played at every ceremony and every funeral, that marked every important moment in a Marine's life. Margaret felt the tears finally come, silent and unstoppable, tracking down her weathered cheeks. She didn't bother to wipe them away. Here, in this moment, they were allowed. From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, the formation stood at attention, perfect and proud. Families sang along or listened in reverent silence. Margaret's lips moved with the words, muscle memory from decades ago, bringing them back with perfect clarity. This was her hymn too, her history, her tradition. These young Marines standing in perfect rows were her legacy as much as David was, her contribution to something that would outlast them all. The hymn concluded. The command was given for the final salute. 400 right hands came up in perfect unison, held and dropped. The ceremony was over. The new Marines broke formation with disciplined chaos, moving to find their families, to accept congratulations, to begin the celebration they had more than earned. Margaret stayed where she was, letting the crowd flow past her. She would find David when the initial rush subsided, when he had greeted his parents and sister, when there was space for a quieter moment between them. She was in no hurry. She had driven 11 hours to be here. She could wait another 20 minutes. The parade ground was emptying now, families streaming toward the reception area, new Marines surrounded by proud relatives. The sun beat down mercilessly. Margaret finally allowed herself to remove the cardigan, folding it carefully over her arm. The relief from the heat was immediate, the slight breeze on her bare forearms almost shocking after the heavy fabric. She was watching the last stragglers leave when a voice spoke behind her, different from before, carrying the weight of command. "Ma'am, I need to speak with you for a moment." Margaret turned to find the base commander standing 3 feet away, his eyes locked on her left forearm, on the faded eagle, globe, and anchor that marked her as one of his own, as someone who had earned the right to stand on this parade ground and watch this ceremony with the understanding that came only from having lived it. The colonel's face had gone still, his eyes moving from the tattoo to her face and back again. When he spoke, his voice carried a respect that hadn't been there in any of the other Marines who had tried to move her along. "When did you serve, ma'am?" 1970 to 1974, Margaret said. "Vietnam era, though I never went to Vietnam. Intelligence, Okinawa mostly, sometime in the Philippines." The colonel was quiet for a moment, processing this information, calculating what it meant to be a woman Marine in that era, what it would have taken to earn that tattoo. "What was your rank when you got out?" "Sergeant," Margaret said. "I was offered staff, but I wanted to start a family." He nodded slowly. Then, without warning, he came to attention and rendered a crisp salute. "Sergeant Foster, on behalf of the United States Marine Corps, thank you for your service." Margaret returned the salute instinctively, her 76-year-old body remembering the movement with perfect clarity. When they dropped their hands, the colonel was smiling slightly. "You should have been inside, Sergeant, in a seat of honor." "I was exactly where I needed to be, sir," Margaret said. "I wanted to see them form up, watch them prepare. The ceremony is beautiful, but that moment before, that's when you can really see what they've become." The colonel studied her for a long moment, and she saw recognition in his eyes, the understanding that came from shared experience. "You know what it costs," he said, not quite a question. "Yes, sir, and I know what it's worth." He glanced toward the crowd, then back at her. "Your grandson is one of the honor graduates, top 10% of his class. His drill instructor spoke highly of him." Pride bloomed in Margaret's chest, fierce and warm. "He's a good Marine, sir." "He comes from good stock," the colonel said. He paused, seeming to make a decision. "Would you join me inside? I'm hosting a reception for the honor graduates and their families. I think you've earned a seat at that table, Sergeant." Margaret looked toward the crowd, seeing David surrounded by his family, his mother crying, his father's hand on his shoulder. She could see the joy in his face, the relief and pride. He looked young and strong, and ready for whatever came next. "Thank you, sir, but I think I'll wait here a bit longer. Let him have his moment with his parents first." The colonel nodded, understanding. "You're welcome to join us whenever you're ready. Just ask any Marine to point you toward the O Club." "Thank you, sir." He started to leave, then turned back. "Sergeant Foster? We're better because of Marines like you, the women who served when it wasn't easy, who proved what was possible." "I hope you know that." Margaret felt her throat tighten again. "I do, sir. Thank you." He walked away, heading toward the main building where the reception was undoubtedly already underway. Margaret watched him go, then turned back to the parade ground. It was mostly empty now, just a few Marines cleaning up, folding chairs, preparing the space for its next use. The heat was still oppressive, the sun still merciless, but Margaret barely noticed. She stood there in the shade, her cardigan folded over her arm, her tattoo visible to anyone who cared to look, and watched the space where 400 young Marines had stood at attention just minutes before. She could still see them in her mind's eye. Perfect rows, perfect uniforms, perfect discipline. She could still hear the hymn, still feel the weight of that final salute. This was why she had come, not just for David, though his achievement mattered enormously, but for this moment, standing on a Marine Corps base, surrounded by the tradition she had helped build, watching the next generation step forward to carry it on. This was her legacy, not publicly acknowledged, not recorded in history books, but real nonetheless. She had been part of this, had contributed to this, had earned the right to stand here and witness what her service had helped create. "Grandma!" She turned to find David approaching, still in his dress blues, his certificate clutched in one hand. His face showed confusion and concern. "What are you doing out here? Everyone's been looking for you. Mom was worried." Margaret smiled at him, reaching out to straighten his already perfect uniform tie. "I wanted to watch the formation. I can see better from here." David glanced down, seeing the tattoo on her forearm for the first time. His eyes widened. "Grandma, is that—" "Yes," she said simply. "Got it in Okinawa in 1973. Your grandfather hated it." She smiled at the memory. "Said it wasn't ladylike." David stared at the faded eagle, globe, and anchor, then looked at his grandmother's face with new understanding. "You never told me you had that." "You never needed to know," Margaret said. "But now you do. Now you understand that when I say I'm proud of you, I know exactly what you've accomplished and what it cost you to get here." David's eyes were wet. He straightened to attention, then rendered a salute, slow, precise, respectful. "Thank you, Sergeant Foster." Margaret returned the salute, her eyes meeting his. "Semper Fi, Marine." When they dropped their hands, David pulled her into a careful hug, mindful of her age, but unable to contain the emotion. Margaret held him, this young man who had chosen the same path she had walked, who would face challenges she could only imagine, who would carry forward the tradition that had defined so much of her life. "Come on," David said when they separated. "Mom's freaking out. And apparently the base commander wants to meet you? Something about an honor graduates reception?" Margaret allowed herself to be led toward the main building, her grandson's arm supporting her gently. Behind them, the parade ground lay empty in the afternoon sun, waiting for the next ceremony, the next group of young men and women who would stand in perfect formation and commit themselves to something larger than their individual lives. The tattoo on Margaret's forearm caught the sunlight as they walked, the faded ink still clearly showing the eagle, globe, and anchor that had marked her 50 years ago as a member of a brotherhood that transcended time and circumstance. She had earned that mark through service and sacrifice, had carried it quietly through decades of civilian life, and now, finally, it had brought her full circle, standing on a Marine Corps base, watching her grandson step into the tradition she had helped build, one difficult day at a time. Inside the reception hall, Marines and families mingled, celebrating the achievement and the beginning of new journeys. Margaret walked through the doors with David beside her, ready to accept the recognition she had never sought but had always deserved, ready to take her place among the Marines who understood what it meant to serve, to sacrifice, to carry forward a tradition built on the courage and commitment of every generation that had come before. The colonel saw her enter and raised his glass in silent salute. Margaret nodded in return, acknowledging the respect between Marines who had served in different eras, but who shared the same core identity, the same fundamental commitment to something greater than themselves. She was home.